Hey, all right, ancient Civ class. Guess what? We have made it through kind of our introduction week, and obviously we were setting the stage and laying the foundation for understanding what civilizations are and what early humans lived like before they became civilized. And now we're going to begin to study different civilizations around the world. And so our focus today actually is going to begin to be Egypt. All right, that's our first civilization that we're going to study. So always try to keep in mind those six characteristics, though, right? Cities, job specialization, writing, organized government, complex religion, and art and architecture, right? Big buildings. Okay, try to keep those in the back of your mind because we're going to see lots and lots of examples of them over the next couple months of this class. Okay, so I've got Google Maps up here, and I'm a nerd. I like to look at Google Maps, especially on the satellite images. It's just really cool to see what the Earth looks like. So I'm going to zoom in here real quick on Egypt though, because we need to talk about its geography briefly. All right, now obviously keep in mind this is a modern border. Okay, this border did not exist, 4 or 5 thousand years ago. But of course, the geography looked the same. And there should be two big takeaways that you notice right away as you're looking at my screen. Um, First of all, you should see that Egypt and pretty much all of its surrounding territory, okay, to the south, to the west, to the east, okay, is all desert, right? Even Egypt itself is pretty much all desert. Okay, so that's the first big takeaway that you should notice, and we're going to come back to that one in a second. So then the question is, okay, well, if Egypt is all a desert, why did they start a civilization there? Well, remember, a couple days ago, we learned about how civilizations often started next to very rich river valleys where the river would flood every year. And so if you zoom in, what you see here is that this green strip of land is the Nile River. Okay, and actually the Nile is not that wide. I won't keep zooming in because my computer's kind of going slow. But most of this green section that you see is actually farmland that's been irrigated and flooded, and so it's very productive farmland. Okay, and then there's a narrow strip in the middle of that green stretch that's actually the river itself. Okay, but that's the reason that civilization started in Egypt. Okay, and actually, if you come on up here, you can see that as the Nile River hits the Mediterranean Sea, it kind of spreads out into what's called a delta, and this is very, very rich farmland up here. And it's much easier to irrigate and to control the flooding up here as it hits the Mediterranean Sea. All right, so that's just a couple of quick pieces about Egypt's geography that you really have to be able to grab hold of to understand Egypt and its history. Let me go back. Why then is it's so important that Egypt is surrounded by desert? Well, in the ancient world especially, it would be almost impossible to cross a desert, especially with an invading army. And so Egypt actually is very, very well protected for big chunks of its history just because it's really impossible to bring an army from just about any direction to attack it. Okay. Yeah, you could come from the north, but sailing and boats were still rather primitive at this point, and that itself also would be very challenging to attack from that direction. Possible, but challenging. Okay, so those are the two big things that you've got to take away, right? The Nile River is the key to Egypt being civilized and why people settled there, and the deserts create isolation and protection for Egypt. All right, I want to give you a very, very brief view of Egyptian history. Okay, their history lasts almost 2,500 years, right? 2,500 years, super, super long. And I'm just going to give you three quick snapshots of it. Okay, just because to go into detail we could spend days and days. So let me go here just to my lovely PowerPoint if I can here. Um, and yeah, again, the focus simply is Egyptian history. So we're not very creative as we name things in Egyptian history, there's 3 periods called kingdoms, and the first one that we come to is called the Old Kingdom. Okay, and this is marked by, again, 2 big themes. If you notice the dates, right? Remember AD and BC. This is 2,700 years BC, before Christ, and then it lasted for 500 years to 2,200 BC, or 2,200 years before Christ. And the 2 big features is, during this kingdom, they built the Great Pyramids, which we're going to study a lot more in depth in a day or two. And they also built, the Sphinx, which again we'll get in more detail. But these are huge, impressive monuments, and really show that their civilization is quite impressive already at this point. Number 2, you'll notice on there is that, again, during this kingdom, Egypt's geography really, really protected and isolated it. And there just aren't that many humans on Earth. And so all of the rivals and potential invaders and disruptors of their civilization just can't get into Egypt. And so Egypt's able to spend all of their resources and time and energy developing the pyramids, right? And the Sphinx. Really, really impressive buildings. Okay. Imagine if America didn't have to spend any money on our military, right? We spend billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars on our military. And if we could use that for other purposes, we could have crazy cool stuff probably. All right. And I'm not saying we should do that, because we need our military to protect us and our allies around the world. But Egypt didn't have to worry about that, right? Their geography and the deserts protected them. Okay. So that's the first kingdom, Old Kingdom. Second period is called the Middle Kingdom. Again, not very creative. And at this point now, Egypt is just very, very stable. They've been a civilization now for 400 or 500 years. Things are just kind of moving like clockwork, right? And so they make many, many other achievements in this time period, more like in art and science and math, and literature. Okay, they kind of branch out from just building the pyramids. So very stable, very prosperous. And they do begin to, at this point, have a military. So there's a few more people now in the world. They're kind of starting to come in contact with some other civilizations, okay? And so they kind of create really what we would call an empire to create a buffer zone, so that if an enemy did attack Egypt, they would run into this new empire before they actually hit Egypt itself. All right, and so Egypt would have a little bit of chance to kind of push back on the invader before they might actually get into the land of Egypt, actually. Well, all right. Next and last time period then is the New Kingdom. And now the world's pretty crowded. Okay, there are civilizations really all around Egypt. Okay, not in the deserts next to Egypt, but just on the other sides of the deserts. And Egypt is really starting to get into a lot of military conflicts. And that's not necessarily their fault or anyone's fault. That's just the way history works. And, for a long time in this New Kingdom, if you look, it lasted almost 1,000 years, okay, 900 years. So for the first 400 or 500, Egypt's still very strong. Sure, they're having conflicts, but no biggie, they're very powerful. But the last 200 or 300 years, especially the groups, the Hittites and the Assyrians, which we will study next unit, those two groups really begin to butt heads with Egypt, and they eventually wear down Egypt. And in fact, the Assyrians conquer Egypt and end them as an independent civilization. Okay, but before we're like, oh man, they fell apart, they got beat. Well, they were an independent civilization for 2,000 years. Okay, that's 10 times as long almost as America's been a nation. So super impressive. Really lots and lots of examples of how they were civilized and how they impacted the world. Okay, so this is your quick overview video, right? Geography of Egypt, brief history of Egypt. Okay, and today you're also going to read a little bit from your textbook, and then do an assignment based on my video here and some pages from the textbook. All right, and then starting tomorrow, we're going to drill down into many more specifics about what Egypt accomplished and what they achieved during their 2,000 years of civilization.